In March of 1944, Victor tested a new driving pattern. Instead of plowing in regular squares, he designed a tight oval path that kept his turn smooth and cut down idle time. He called it streamlining. His neighbor thought it was crazy. His cousin said, "You've been out in the sun too long, Vic." But by the end of the week, he had saved nearly 15% in fuel. And that was just one tractor on one field. The big moment came when Victor began imagining the battlefield. He had a cousin who drove supply trucks for the army in France. The stories were bad. Convoys stopped for hours, burning fuel while waiting in line. Engines left running to stay warm. Routes forced through hilly ground that drained the tanks dry. Victor asked himself a simple question. What if convoys moved like my tractor? That one sentence would not leave him. He began drawing out idea models for truck movement, convoy speed timing, following patterns where vehicles stayed close together to cut down wind resistance, time speed up and slow down schedules, even rest stop rotations to stop engine sitting. He was not a military man. He did not know rules or special words, but what he had was a lifetime of watching how engines work and how people waste fuel when they do not have to. In May of 1944, Victor wrote a letter. It was addressed to an old friend from high school, now a supply officer in the U.S. Army, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Morrison, stationed in England. In 5 pages, Victor explained what he called the convoy efficiency doctrine. It was handwritten, half in cursive, half in print with drawings of truck groups that looked a lot like farm equipment rows. Victor ended the letter with one line. I may be a farmer, but fuel is fuel, and I think you're wasting it. He sealed the envelope, dropped it in the mailbox, and went back to plowing. He did not expect an answer. He certainly did not expect that weeks later, one of the busiest supply officers in the European theater would read that letter 3 times and then mark it. Interesting, worth a test. The idea sounded crazy, but in war, crazy sometimes gets results. First test, a careful step forward. The letter sat on Lieutenant Colonel Henry Morrison's desk for almost 2 weeks before he finally picked it up again. It was June of 1944. The Normandy landings had just happened and Allied supplies were already struggling under the weight of their own speed. Morrison had 100 real problems to solve, but something about Victor's letter bothered him. Morrison was not a sentimental man, but he remembered Victor from high school, quiet, smart in his own way, always measuring things no one else bothered to. And now here he was suggesting that American military convoys could save thousands of gallons of gasoline just by moving smarter. It sounded crazy, but it also sounded testable. So Morrison pulled a few strings. In late June, a small convoy, Convoy 37, was planned to move fuel drums from a temporary storage place outside Liège, Belgium, to an advanced supply point near Havre. It was a routine run of roughly 90 miles through back roads and forested areas, perfect for a low-risk experiment. Morrison picked 24 trucks for the test. Each was loaded with standard 55-gallon fuel drums. The drivers were told about new orders. Keep a steady speed of 25 miles per hour. Stay within 50 feet of the vehicle in front and avoid unnecessary sitting at checkpoints. No engine racing. No rushing up hills. If a truck stopped, the entire convoy would slow, not stop. The drivers were doubtful. One of them, Private Enoch Wise, said, "This sounds like something my granddad would try with his mule cart." Another joked, "What's next? Corn-fed engines?" But orders were orders. The convoy set off just after dawn. At first, things went smoothly. The lead driver, a sergeant with a habit of grinding through gears, had to get used to the steady rhythm. Some of the younger drivers struggled to hold formation. A few nearly hit the truck ahead during downhill parts, but they got used to it. The most surprising result came at the halfway checkpoint. Fuel records showed that on average, the trucks had used nearly 10% less gasoline than previous runs over the same route. Mechanics double-checked. Gauges were checked again. The numbers stayed the same. It wasn't just luck, but on the return trip, things fell apart. A thunderstorm rolled in. Mud covered the sides of the narrow roads. One truck skidded and jackknifed, forcing the entire convoy to stop. Engines sat for over an hour while recovery crews cleared the path. The final fuel use ended up only a little better than normal. When Morrison got the report, his staff called the results unclear. He wrote to Victor with careful praise, but warned, this may not work bigger. Military roads are not Iowa cornfields. Victor's reply came within a week. Your roads may be worse, but your engines still burn fuel the same way. Then he added, give it one more try and teach your drivers how to think like farmers. That last line stuck with Morrison. He did not know it yet, but he was about to run the second test, this time with a much bigger convoy. And this time the results would be impossible to ignore. By the middle of July 1944, Victor Hawthorne's crazy idea had become a running joke inside certain supply circles. In one mess hall near Le Havre, a sergeant was heard saying, next, we'll be planting corn along the roadside to keep the trucks fed. Others called it tractor theory, a mean way of talking about the suggestion that convoy fuel use could be solved by a farmer's timing techniques. Even Morrison, who had allowed the first test, was worried about pushing it further. He had no shortage of doubters watching him. Higher command was focused on speed, not savings. The motto was deliver fast, burn what you must. But the numbers from Convoy 37 stayed in his mind. Even with the storm-related delay, the first leg had shown nearly 10% savings in fuel. Morrison knew that multiplied over hundreds of trucks, that meant thousands of gallons each day. He decided to take a chance. On August 3rd, Morrison handpicked a larger convoy, 120 vehicles planned to deliver ammunition, fuel, and medical supplies from the port of Cherbourg to forward units near Chartres, a drive of over 160 miles. This time, he went further. The drivers got a full briefing based entirely on Victor's ideas. Keep a strict formation. No fast speed-ups or hard braking. Sit still only when you absolutely have to. Use ground to your advantage. Coast downhill. Ease into turns and avoid gear changes that weren't needed. One mechanic even created a quick reference card for each dashboard. Steady saves. Rushing wastes. Again, the reaction was mixed. Some drivers followed the new methods exactly. Others made fun of them. But the convoy moved out at dawn in long, organized rows. Watchers stationed at checkpoints along the route tracked fuel levels and behavior. And by evening, when the trucks pulled into the staging area near Chartres, something amazing had happened. Fuel use had dropped by more than 14%. The trucks arrived ahead of schedule with fewer breakdowns than usual. Tire wear was lower. Even driver tiredness was clearly reduced. It was not just a savings report. It was proof it worked. When Morrison sent the final report up the chain of command, he included a one-line summary. The farmer was right. That same week, the Quartermaster Corps allowed a limited rollout of the Hawthorne method across multiple convoy operations. It was still unofficial, not standardized, and not yet rules, but word spread fast. Drivers began sharing tips over radios. Mechanics in rear storage areas adjusted engine tuning to better fit the steady pace model. Some platoons drew chalk lines on their windshields to help judge spacing more correctly while following. One unit in the Red Ball Express even created a makeshift slogan, line tight, fuel light. Victor got a letter from Morrison, typed in all capital letters at the bottom. We're teaching them to think like you. Victor read it twice. Then he folded the paper and placed it inside his notebook right next to his original fuel tests from the cornfields of Iowa. He had not won a medal. He had not stood before any generals. But the wheels were turning now, and soon the Army would realize it was not just a good idea. It was necessary. By late August of 1944, Allied command faced a puzzle. Victory was in sight, yet the front lines were threatening to stop, not from German fighting, but from their own supply lines, breaking under pressure. Every day, the Red Ball Express was moving over 12,000 tons of supplies across northern France with more than 6,000 trucks working around the clock. But the fuel they were burning just to stay moving was using up precious reserves that could have powered tanks, planes, or field hospitals. Behind the scenes, Henry Morrison had begun pushing the so-called Hawthorne method more strongly. After the success near Chartres, he argued that fuel saving was no longer an experiment. It was a must-have plan. And then the turning point came. A large-scale operation was planned to resupply the advancing Ninth Army as it prepared to cross the Meuse River. The route covered over 200 miles of broken roads, loose gravel, and open ground open to attacks. The plan needed over 400 trucks in matched movement, 400 engines, 400 drivers, and countless chances to waste fuel or fall apart. Morrison made a bold call. He ordered the entire operation to follow the Hawthorne rules, not just fuel timing, but formation driving, matched coasting, pre-planned speed-up zones, and even changed rest schedules to stop unnecessary sitting. Each convoy unit got a laminated instruction card. It included the phrase, "Being careful is protection." It was more than a guideline. It was now policy. There were quick complaints. One major argued, "We are fighting a war, not driving to a Sunday picnic." Others warned that slowing down would make convoys easier targets. But Morrison stood firm. His report laid it out clearly. "We are not choosing between fast and slow. We are choosing between movement and stopping. Wasted fuel is lost ground." The convoy rolled out under a gray dawn sky. What happened next would later be described in after-war supply journals as the first modern military fuel-saving operation under combat conditions. Trucks moved like clockwork. Drivers kept formation through towns and open country alike. When hills came up, they shifted gears early and coasted together. When night fell, their convoy lights moved like a ribbon through the landscape, tight, steady, with purpose. Watchers noted that the units using the Hawthorne method not only used less fuel, they also had fewer breakdowns, arrived faster than the expected window, and had higher spirits. Drivers reported feeling more focused, less tired, even proud of their work. But the real shock came when the final numbers were put together. The convoy had used 19% less fuel than identical runs made just 2 weeks earlier. That meant thousands of gallons saved, enough to power an entire armored group for an extra day, for a command struggling to keep up with the constant push toward Germany. That single margin could mean the difference between moving forward and grinding to a stop. After that, no one called it crazy anymore. Morrison got a direct award from Supreme Headquarters. His team was given the job of putting the fuel-saving rules across multiple areas. Training manuals were updated. Drill instructors began teaching the timing and spacing rules to new drivers. Supply officers began planning routes not just by distance, but by ground and energy cost. And in a quiet Iowa farmhouse, Victor Hawthorne got a second letter. This time it came with a unit patch from the Red Ball Express and a short note, "Your roads run across Europe now." He hung the patch over his workbench. Outside, the harvest was beginning. Inside, Victor finally smiled. December 1944. The snow came early that year, thick and punishing. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, you could barely see. Temperatures dropped below freezing. For the men of the Allied front lines, it felt like the world had gone silent, too silent. Then on December 16th, the silence broke. More than 200,000 German troops supported by tanks and big guns launched a surprise attack. The goal, punch through the thin Allied lines, recapture Antwerp, and split American and British forces. Hitler called it Operation Watch on the Rhine. History would remember it as the Battle of the Bulge. The first shock was terrible. Entire units were cut off. Communication fell apart. Fuel storage areas were captured or destroyed. Weather stopped Allied air support. And for the first time in months, American forces were defending. But the Germans had a problem of their own. Their entire attack counted on capturing Allied fuel. Without it, their tanks would become steel coffins. In response, Allied command rushed to reroute convoys fast. Henry Morrison was pulled into emergency meetings with quartermasters and field commanders. They needed fuel, thousands of gallons of it, moved across dangerous roads, through blackout conditions, in blizzards, and under threat of attack. And the only convoys that could possibly make it were the ones trained under the Hawthorne method. In the second week of the German attack, a group of American tank destroyers in Bastogne was down to 12 hours of fuel. Air resupply was impossible. The only option was ground transport. Morrison personally ordered a Hawthorne train convoy out of Dinant, 85 trucks, 300 miles, no air cover. The drivers were told, if you stop, they die. They moved in silence, headlights off. Engines kept low to reduce sound. The roads were icy with curves that had already killed other vehicles. Snow piled on the hoods. Radiators steamed in the cold like breath from tired lungs. At one point, a lead truck hit a mine hole and lurched sideways, but the driver, a 19-year-old corporal named Reginald Ellis, tapped the brakes gently, kept the engine steady, and waved the line onward. No shouting, no chaos, just discipline, just movement. By the time they reached Bastogne, only 2 trucks had failed to make it. The rest rolled in, fuel tanks full, engines still running. Soldiers cheered as the first fuel drums were unloaded. The battle raged for another 3 weeks, but that one convoy kept the line from breaking. The numbers told a hard truth. Convoys not trained in fuel-saving methods had failure rates of 30% or more. Vehicles stopping, breaking down, getting lost. Hawthorne convoys less than 10% failure, and in several cases, fuel use dropped by over 20% even in combat zones. Victor never knew the exact details. He did not hear the radio calls or feel the cold wind cutting through the Ardennes. But he did hear something else. In January of 1945, a local Army recruiter visited the town of Storm Lake giving a speech at the community hall. He mentioned in passing that certain new convoy methods had helped keep the lines alive during Germany's final push. Victor sat in the back, arms crossed. When the crowd clapped, he nodded once, not for himself, but for the drivers who had kept going through snow, through enemy fire, through impossible odds. Because sometimes the war is won not by the men who pull the trigger, but by those who make sure the wheels keep turning. The war ended in May of 1945. Victory was not sudden. It came in stages. A German surrender followed by silence, then disbelief, and finally, the slow flood of relief. For most soldiers, it meant the chance to go home. For Victor Hawthorne, home had never changed. He was still in Storm Lake, still walking the rows of his cornfield with the same careful steps, still writing fuel use in the same worn notebooks. The war had passed through his life like a gust of wind through an open barn, loud, powerful, but barely leaving a mark behind, except for the letters. Over the course of that final year, Victor had gotten nearly a dozen of them. Some were from Henry Morrison with fuel reports, convoy results, and thanks. Others were from drivers, men he had never met. One letter from a sergeant in the Red Ball Express simply read, "Your idea got me through the Ardennes. My boys are alive. That's on you." Victor never replied, not because he did not care, but because he did not know what to say. He had never wanted praise. He had only wanted to solve a problem, but praise came anyway. In late summer, Victor got an envelope stamped from Washington, D.C. Inside was an award signed by the Army Quartermaster General. It thanked him for help with convoy work and fuel discipline. There was no medal, no parade, just a certificate, a patch from the Red Ball Express, and a note from Morrison. Turns out tractors and tanks aren't so different after all. Victor framed the certificate, hung the patch above his workbench. Then quietly, he went back to his fields. But the world had changed. In the years after the war, civilian trucking companies began studying Army convoy methods. University supply departments wrote papers talking about Hawthorne-style formation driving and spread out engine load theory, phrases Victor would never have used, but ideas he had lived. By 1950, at least 4 major freight companies in the United States had used versions of his fuel-saving approach. In 1953, the Department of Defense officially added convoy work training to driver instruction at Fort Lee, Virginia, and decades later, when fuel crises hit in the 1970s, industry experts pulled out Army manuals from World War II, and there, buried in the back sections, was a name, Hawthorne, a quiet Iowa farmer who had never set foot on a battlefield, but whose rows and rhythms had helped keep an army moving. Victor never looked for the spotlight, but one day, his nephew, fresh back from the Korean War, asked him, "Uncle Vic, is it true you save fuel for the army?" Victor just smiled and said, "I saved fuel for my tractor." The army happened to be watching. I've thought a lot about Victor Hawthorne, not just as a man in a story, but as a symbol of something we often miss. He wasn't a general. He wasn't a scientist. He wasn't decorated or celebrated in public squares. He never wore a uniform, never fired a shot, never crossed an ocean, but in his own way, he changed the tide of a global war, not with a bullet, but with a question. What if we moved differently? That's it. That's all he asked. A question born not in a meeting room or a battlefield, but in a field of corn. A question so simple it was easy to laugh at until it saved lives. What moves me most is that Victor never chased praise. He didn't invent a theory to put his name in history books. He didn't want thanks. He just saw waste and tried to fix it quietly, carefully, with a pencil, a notebook, and an engine's hum in the background. And somehow that quiet act of being careful rippled across continents. It makes me wonder how many victories are built on invisible hands. How many unsung people, farmers, drivers, medics, code clerks, janitors, have changed the course of history by simply refusing to waste what they were given. Victor's legacy isn't just about gasoline. It's about care, discipline, being exact, and belief. The belief that small things, when multiplied by thousands of people over time, can become movements. In a war defined by explosions and heroism, maybe the most amazing act was saving a gallon of fuel. So next time you see a long line of trucks on the highway, steady and spaced, moving like clockwork, you might just be watching a whisper of Victor Hawthorne's idea, still alive, still working. Because sometimes the war is not won by charging forward, it's won by keeping the wheels turning. What part of Victor's story surprised you the most? Leave a comment below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, share it. Someone else might need to hear that even the quietest efforts can echo across time.